Welcome to the Silent Empires, where influence speaks softly and every story leaves a shadow behind. No interruptions, no noise, just immersive storytelling for those who understand that real power rarely needs to be loud. If this story stayed with you, if it pulled you into its world for even a moment, take a second to like the video. And down in the comments, tell me something simple. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? I want to see how far these stories travel and who's still awake, listening in the quiet with me tonight. In the dim hallway of a Harlem tenement, the line between luck and fear fit easily on a scrap of paper. A woman in a house dress clutched a folded betting slip as footsteps thundered up the stairs. Doors cracked open. Voices dropped to whispers. At the far end of the corridor, plainclothes detectives moved with harsh certainty, pushing past children and mothers and men just home from night shifts. Somewhere behind the plaster walls, a small bank of coins and records, a tangle of ledgers and telephone lines, connected this building to hundreds of others across the city. To the people who bet, it was a chance, a ritual, a tiny rebellion against hard odds. To city officials, it was an illegal lottery that refused to die. And to law enforcement and underworld insiders alike, there was one name that always floated behind the paper trail and the fear: Michael Mike Coppola. He almost never appeared in newspaper photographs. When he did, it was a guarded face, unsmiling, ringed by attorneys and detectives. But his absence from the frame did not mean absence from the story. For decades, the invisible economy of numbers gambling in Harlem and the Bronx funneled up through chains of runners, collectors, and middlemen, until finally it hit the quiet, calculating world of Coppola. He was whispered about as a gunman in the Prohibition years, then as a behind-the-scenes power broker. By the time Senate committees and crime commissions began hunting for a face to attach to the city's illegal gambling, his name had become shorthand for a particular kind of underworld authority, confident, ruthless, and well-connected. Yet the man who would be called Trigger Mike did not begin life with a gun in his hand or a racket in his pocket. He began like millions of others, in a landscape of poverty and migration, in a time when the United States promised more than it delivered. To understand how an Italian boy from the southern tip of Europe grew into one of New York's most feared and elusive mob figures, the story has to go back to a world of narrow village streets and steamship tickets bought with borrowed money. Michael Coppola was born on November 2, 1900, in the Calabria region of southern Italy, the toe of the Italian boot. At the turn of the 20th century, Calabria was a place of rocky hillsides and subsistence farming, a region long neglected by the Italian state. Land reform barely touched its villages. Drought, floods, and falling crop prices pushed families to the edge. Local power often rested not with distant authorities in Rome, but with landlords, moneylenders, and, in some areas, criminal fraternities that filled the vacuum left by weak institutions. There is little detailed documentation about Coppola's earliest years, and his family did not leave behind memoirs or diaries. But broader records and immigration data make clear that he belonged to a generation of Calabrian peasants and laborers who saw only one realistic path out of chronic poverty: the long voyage to America. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians crossed the Atlantic, many of them from southern regions like Calabria. They sold livestock, mortgaged land, and borrowed from relatives to buy passage on crowded steamships bound for New York. Sometime in his early childhood, the Coppola family joined that tide. Passenger manifests from the era are filled with families whose stories echo what Michael's must have been. Father listed as laborer, mother as housewife, children bundled together under a single family name, all carrying a few trunks and a hope that the streets of New York would be less unforgiving than the fields of home. They arrived in a city already straining under the weight of rapid industrialization and mass migration, but also in a place where ethnic enclaves provided a buffer against the disorienting scale of America. For Italians like the Coppolas, That buffer was the tenement neighborhoods of Manhattan, most famously Little Italy on the Lower East Side, but also the growing Italian section of East Harlem. Census data and later law enforcement reports suggest that Michael grew up in East Harlem, an area clustered around Pleasant Avenue and the upper reaches of First and Second Avenues. It was here that Calabrians, Sicilians, Neapolitans, and other Southern Italians clustered around familiar dialects and regional ties, recreating fragments of the villages they had left behind. The streets around him were crowded and noisy, layered with the smells of cooking oil, coal smoke, and the river not far off. Families were squeezed into railroad apartments, long narrow units with rooms strung in a row. Water might come from a hallway tap, heat from a coal or wood stove. Children slept several to a bed. In summer, windows stayed open, and life spilled out onto the stoops and sidewalks. Boys played street games, dodged horse-drawn carts and later automobile traffic, and watched adults conduct business on corners and in cramped storefronts. From an early age, Michael would have seen two sharply contrasting faces of New York. One was the world of legitimate struggle, his parents or older siblings taking whatever work they could find, on construction crews in factories on the docks, sweeping streets, sewing garments. Wages were low and hours long, and Italian immigrants were often at the bottom of the hearing list. Newspapers of the time carried open prejudice. Dago and wop were not unusual words in editorials and cartoons. As late as the 1910s, some employers openly advertised that they would not hire Italians. The other face of the city was the world of informal and illegal economies that grew in response to those conditions. In East Harlem, petty crime, street gangs, and more organized forms of extortion and gambling flourished. They did so in the shadows of the same tenements where families tried to live honest lives. For some residents, these underground networks were a constant threat. Protection rackets demanded payments from shopkeepers. Loan sharks preyed on the desperate. For others, especially ambitious young men who saw little future in factory or dock work, those same networks looked like a ladder, a way to climb quickly in a system that otherwise seemed stacked against them. By the time Michael was a boy, the earliest forms of what would become the American Mafia were already taking shape in his neighborhood. The Morello crime family, led by former Sicilian bandit Giuseppe Morello and later his half-brothers, had established itself in East Harlem and the Bronx in the first decade of the century. They ran counterfeiting operations, extorted local businesses, and began to insert themselves into the flow of money across Italian neighborhoods. The Morello group and smaller Calabrian and Neapolitan gangs did not operate openly. They worked through intermediaries, behind bars and storefronts and social clubs, but their presence was an open secret. Young Michael grew up watching men who seemed to command deference without wearing uniforms or official titles. In a society where many immigrants felt looked down on by police, courts, and politicians, these underworld figures projected a different kind of power, rooted in fear, but also in their ability to get things done. They could arrange jobs, settle disputes, and provide a rough kind of protection, even as they themselves were often the ones creating the dangers in the first place. Formal schooling in such an environment rarely held a boy's attention for long. School attendance records from the period show high rates of truancy and early dropout among children of working-class immigrant families. Older kids were expected to help support the household. They hawked newspapers, shined shoes, carried packages, and picked up shifts in factories as soon as they could pass for the legal working age. It would be unusual, not typical, for a child like Michael to have pursued education beyond the 8th grade. Later law enforcement profiles of Coppola emphasize his streetwise intelligence rather than any formal learning, an ability to read people, manage money, and keep an operation running discreetly. At the same time, East Harlem was not just an incubator for crime. It was a place where fraternal societies, mutual aid organizations, and Catholic parishes tried to pull young men away from trouble, offering sports clubs, religious instruction, and social events. Priests and community leaders preached hard work, thrift, and loyalty to family as the route to respectability. But those messages were competing with the visible evidence that some of the most materially successful men in the neighborhood were those who bent or broke the law. The young faced a stark visual contrast: the factory laborer coming home exhausted, and the local gambler or strongman who seemed always to have cash, nicer clothes, and influence. As the 1910s wore on, the broader currents of history touched even the narrow streets of East Harlem. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, and while the United States did not enter World War I until 1917, the conflict disrupted trade and sent ripples through immigrant communities. Some Italian men returned to fight in European armies. Others stayed, wary of a homeland that had not done much for them. In 1918, when Michael turned 18, the United States was drafting young men, but existing public records do not clearly document his military status. Whether he faced conscription, avoided it, or was exempt, the more important fact for his future was that the war accelerated social change in New York. Women entered factories in greater numbers, returning soldiers demanded jobs, and the demand for alcohol, entertainment, and distraction did not diminish. If the war years were marked by upheaval, the decade that followed fundamentally reshaped the criminal landscape in which Coppola moved. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. Prohibition had been championed as a moral reform, a way to reduce domestic violence, public disorder, and the corrosive effects of alcohol on families. In practice, it created one of the largest black markets in American history. For established gangs and emerging criminal entrepreneurs, prohibition was less a moral question than a business opportunity of unprecedented scale. The demand for alcohol did not vanish, it simply moved underground. Speakeasies, backroom bars, and private clubs flourished. Someone had to make, import, transport, and protect the liquor that flowed into those establishments. In Italian neighborhoods, figures connected to the old Morello organization, along with newer groups, began to invest in bootlegging operations. They linked up with Irish, Jewish, and other ethnic gangs, forming pragmatic, sometimes unstable alliances. It is in this period, Coppola's early 20s, that his name begins to surface in law enforcement files and underworld lore. Exact dates and events are often difficult to verify, as much of what we know comes from later testimony by informants, police reports, and journalistic investigations that stitch together fragments of hearsay and partial records. But the pattern is clear. Michael moved from the world of petty neighborhood delinquency into the more structured and more dangerous universe of organized crime. He found his place not as a flashy public figure, but as a working enforcer. Prohibition-era gangs needed men who could move quickly, follow orders, and show a willingness to use violence without drawing unnecessary attention. They guarded shipments, collected debts, and discouraged rivals. Public accounts from investigators and rivals suggest that Coppola earned a reputation in these years for being cool under pressure and unafraid to carry out violent assignments. It was likely during this period that he acquired the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Trigger Mike. Nicknames in the underworld served multiple purposes. They could be affectionate, mocking, or intimidating. They also helped insiders and outsiders alike distinguish among men who often shared similar names. In Coppola's case, the Trigger label underscored his perceived role. It marked him not as the brain of a large enterprise, at least not yet, but as someone whose readiness to use a gun was well known among his peers. Law enforcement officials would later repeat the nickname with a mixture of frustration and unease. Aware that it hinted at a body count, they rarely had the evidence to prove in court. Prohibition also accelerated the development of more centralized, disciplined crime families. The loosely organized street gangs of the previous generation began to coalesce into structures that resembled corporations, with clear hierarchies, territories, and profit centers. In this new order, the older Morello faction lost ground to younger, more ambitious leaders. Among them was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who would eventually help design the modern American mafia's five-family system in New York. During the 1920s, Luciano was still climbing, forging alliances with figures like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello. Michael Coppola gravitated into this orbit. By the late 1920s, multiple sources place him as an operative associated with the organization that would later be known as the Luciano, and then the Genovese crime family. He was not yet the powerful numbers boss he would become, but he was part of a network that handled bootlegging, gambling, and protection rackets in East Harlem and beyond. His Italian heritage, neighborhood roots, and proven reliability made him a natural fit for an outfit that prized loyalty and discretion. The New York of these years was roaring, flush with jazz, speakeasies, and a stock market that seemed to promise endless ascent. But beneath the surface glamour lay a harsher reality for many of the city's residents, especially in immigrant quarters. Economic inequality remained stark, and the informal economies of racketeering fed or exploited that gap, depending on where one stood. For some Italian families, connections to men like Coppola brought small advantages. A job arranged here, a debt postponed there, a relative's grievance handled without recourse to official channels. For others, those same connections brought only fear and financial strain. Michael's rise within this environment did not happen in isolation from the law. Police raids on speakeasies and gambling dens were common. Periodic crackdowns would sweep up low-level operatives. But corruption, underfunding, and the sheer scale of illicit activity made it difficult to dismantle the networks behind the street-level arrests. Politicians, especially those tied to the Tammany Hall machine, were themselves implicated in arrangements with gamblers and bootleggers. In this world of selective enforcement and quietly negotiated deals, men like Coppola learned how to survive, keeping a low public profile, insulating themselves behind buffers, and limiting what they said in front of anyone who might someday testify. Nothing in these years suggested that Michael Coppola was destined for national notoriety. He was one of many young men hardened by poverty and prejudice, skilled in streetcraft, willing to work for dangerous employers. Yet the skills he was hunting, organizing collections, moving money discreetly, enforcing discipline without constant supervision, were exactly those that would become crucial later, when the center of his world shifted from liquor to numbers gambling. As the decade closed, storm clouds gathered that would further reconfigure both the city and the underworld. The stock market crash of 1929 ushered in the Great Depression, plunging millions into unemployment and insecurity. Legal jobs dried up. The temptation to seek income through illegal means grew stronger. At the same time, internal wars within the Italian-American underworld, the most violent of them, the Calabria War between rival mafia factions around 1930-1931, reshuffled leadership and loyalties. Michael, still in his late 20s and early 30s, stood on the threshold of a transformed criminal landscape. In the streets where he had grown up, the next phase of his life was already taking shape. The same crowded tenements that had birthed his generation of immigrant children were now fertile ground for a different kind of enterprise. A daily numbers game that would capture the hopes and paychecks of Harlem and the Bronx, and that would help turn a once obscure enforcer into a name whispered in gambling parlors and government hearing rooms alike. The stock market's collapse in 1929 turned a decade of exuberance into a long season of anxiety. In immigrant neighborhoods like East Harlem, the change was immediate and brutal. Construction slowed, factories cut shifts, and the fragile security that working families had begun to build simply crumbled. Unemployment lines snaked around blocks. Soup kitchens appeared in church basements. For young men who had already been living close to the bone, the Depression did not simply lower expectations. It made the odds of getting ahead through legitimate work look almost imaginary. In those same years, another kind of war was being waged out of public view. Inside New York's Italian underworld, rival factions were fighting for dominance in what became known as the Calabria War, a bloody struggle from 1930 to 1931 between the old guard boss Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, and the upstart Sicilian faction led by Salvatore Maranzano. The conflict reached into East Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, involving gunmen, informers, and shifting alliances. Michael Coppola did not appear in the headlines that chronicled this conflict, but the war's outcome reshaped the structure of the very organization he had joined at the street level. By 1931, with bodies piling up and police pressure mounting, younger leaders like Charles "Lucky" Luciano decided that the old ways were unsustainable. Luciano secretly arranged Masseria's murder, then helped orchestrate Maranzano's assassination a few months later. In the aftermath, Luciano and his allies reorganized the Italian-American underworld. They established what would become known as the Commission, a sort of board of directors for organized crime, and formalized New York's crime families into 5 major organizations. The group that would eventually be called the Genovese family, after one of Luciano's key lieutenants, Vito Genovese, emerged as a powerhouse with deep roots in Manhattan and the Bronx. Within this new framework, soldiers and lower-ranking figures like Coppola found their world more structured, but also more stable. Hierarchies were clearer. Territories and revenue streams were assigned and defended with an eye toward long-term profit rather than constant, chaotic infighting. Prohibition was still in force, and bootlegging remained lucrative. But for far-sighted bosses, the Depression underscored a hard truth. Any single line of illegal business could be disrupted. Diversification became a watchword, and nowhere did that principle take on more significance than in the world of illegal gambling. Harlem, just a short trolley or subway ride from East Harlem, was at the heart of that world. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Harlem was the symbolic capital of Black America, home to writers, musicians, and political thinkers of what came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. But it was also a neighborhood where jobs were scarce, rents were high, and discrimination was unrelenting. In that environment, a simple daily betting game known as policy, or the numbers, became both a community ritual and a parallel economy. The mechanics of the numbers racket were straightforward. Bettors chose a 3-digit number, often between 0 and 999, and wagered small sums, nickels, dimes, maybe a quarter. The winning number each day was derived from publicly available figures, such as the handle of racetrack betting or the daily totals on certain financial markets. That method ensured that the numbers could not be easily rigged by local operators. If a player's number hit, the payout could be many times the original bet. For people living paycheck to paycheck, it offered a tantalizing, if statistically unlikely, way out of constant shortage. African American entrepreneurs had built the earliest and most successful numbers empires in Harlem. Figures like Casper Holstein and Madame Stephanie St. Clair organized sophisticated betting operations with networks of writers who took bets, runners who carried slips and money to central offices, and bankers who set odds and paid out winnings. They cultivated goodwill by providing loans, sponsoring charitable events, and supporting churches and civic causes. At a time when mainstream financial institutions largely ignored or exploited Black Harlem, the numbers operators became, in a sense, informal bankers and employers. Yet the profitability of the racket also attracted the attention of white criminal organizations, including the Italian Mafia. To men like Luciano and Genovese, the Harlem numbers game represented a reliable stream of cash that did not depend on the volatile enforcement of prohibition laws. It ran on habits and hopes, and as the Depression deepened, those habits only intensified. More people bet more frequently, hopping for a windfall that legitimate employment no longer seemed able to provide. The first major white figure to drive into Harlem's numbers business with real force was Dutch Schultz, a Jewish-American gangster who had built his fortune in bootlegging in the Bronx and Manhattan. Born Arthur Flegenheimer, Schultz was notoriously aggressive, quick to use threats and physical intimidation to secure his interests. Around the early 1930s, as his alcohol profits faced challenges, he turned his attention to Harlem's policy bankers. He did not come as a negotiator. He came as a conqueror. Schultz's push into Harlem brought violence and pressure. Black numbers operators were beaten or arrested, their businesses raided with the help of police officers on Schultz's payroll. Some were forced to pay protection to maintain any share of their own operations. Others were sidelined entirely. Madame St. Clair famously resisted, sending anonymous letters denouncing corrupt officers and using her own influence to fight back, but the tide was against independent operators. The combination of Schultz's muscle and political connections gradually shifted control over large portions of the Harlem numbers trade into his hands. The Italian mafia's relationship with Schultz was complex. Luciano and his associates were wary of his unpredictability but recognized his usefulness. For a time, they allowed him latitude, including in Harlem, in exchange for cuts of profits and general coexistence. In this shifting mosaic of alliances, Michael Coppola was still a subordinate figure, but his skills and location were increasingly important. East Harlem sat at the hinge between Italian and black neighborhoods, between old bootlegging roots and the new gambling empires. Men who knew the streets, the local police precincts, and the neighborhood's unwritten rules were invaluable as messengers, collectors, and enforcers. Law enforcement documents from later years, as well as testimonies from various investigations, suggest that during the mid-1930s Coppola was already closely tied to the Harlem and Bronx gambling rackets under the umbrella of the Luciano, Genovese organization. He was still not the public face of any enterprise. Those who dealt with him encountered a man who preferred to stay in the background. But internally, his reliability and quiet toughness were noticed. The turning point in the balance of power came not from a turf skirmish over numbers, but from Dutch Schultz's own overreach. By the mid-1930s, Schultz had become a prime target for New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who was building a national reputation by going after high-profile racketeers. Schultz was indicted for tax evasion and faced intense scrutiny. Furious at Dewey's campaign, Schultz proposed to solve his problem in the most direct way possible, by killing the prosecutor. He argued that Dewey's elimination would frighten off other ambitious lawmen. The plan alarmed other underworld leaders. Luciano and the commission feared that assassinating a prominent public official would provoke a ferocious backlash, threatening all of their enterprises. When Schultz pressed ahead with preparations despite their objections, the commission made a fateful decision. Schultz, not Dewey, would be the one to die. In October 1935, gunmen entered a Newark restaurant where Schultz was dining and shot him and several associates. He died the next day in a hospital, rambling to detectives in a semi-coherent stream that yielded no useful information. With Schultz removed, his far-flung rackets did not vanish. They were divided. Harlem's numbers operations, in particular, were too lucrative to be ignored. Luciano and Genovese moved to assert more direct Italian control over the policy business, building on inroads already made and using their broader organizational muscle to stabilize and expand profits. It was in this context, according to later FBI assessments and organized crime surveys, that Michael "Trigger" Mike Coppola's influence began to grow decisively. Instead of trying to run every storefront and betting spot themselves, the Italian families adopted a model that retained much of the existing neighborhood infrastructure. Black numbers writers and runners continued to operate in Harlem streets and apartment houses. Some black bankers also stayed in place, but authority at the top shifted. Many operations now paid tribute to, or were outright controlled by, Italian overseers who handled the money once it moved beyond the neighborhood level. In practical terms, that meant that a significant share of Harlem's betting revenue began to flow through men like Coppola into the coffers of the Genovese family. Accounts from the period describe Coppola as one of the principal Italian figures managing Harlem's numbers in the late 1930s and early 1940s, operating primarily out of East Harlem. The structure under him was layered and, from a business standpoint, efficient. At the street level, writers took bets at candy stores, barber shops, newsstands, and kitchen tables, recording numbers in small pads or on slips of paper. Runners collected those slips and the accompanying cash several times a day, moving them to central policy banks, which were often nothing more than modest apartments or back rooms safeguarded by trusted personnel. From there, the information and money traveled higher. Clerks totaled bets, calculated exposures, and recorded entries in ledgers that were coded or disguised as ordinary business records. Cash was bundled, skimmed, and hand-delivered up the chain. At the upper levels, where Coppola operated, the work involved balancing risk across different territories, making sure that no single combination of numbers could cause catastrophic losses, and deciding how to handle late bets, disputed payouts, or dishonest subordinates. It also meant maintaining an uneasy relationship with law enforcement, paying off some officers, monitoring the activities of others, and occasionally sacrificing lower-level operatives to keep the larger machinery running. Harlem's black community did not simply acquiesce to Italian dominance. Figures like Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, who had long been involved in Harlem's underworld, emerged as intermediaries and negotiators. According to later interviews and biographies, Johnson reached an accommodation with Luciano's organization. Black operators would retain a portion of control and profits, while acknowledging overarching Italian authority and sharing revenues. In this negotiated order, Coppola occupied a crucial but largely unseen position. He represented the power of the Genovese family in Harlem's day-to-day gambling economy, even as black figures remained the visible face of many neighborhood operations. On the surface, life in East Harlem during these years looked deceptively ordinary. Children went to school, women shopped at pushcarts and small groceries, men stood on corners scanning help-wanted notices. Yet woven into that everyday life was the constant presence of the numbers game. Housewives played their birthdays or dream numbers, suggested by spiritual advisors. Janitors placed bets collected from building residents. Factory workers pooled small stakes in hopes one of them would hit and pay for a shared celebration or overdue bills. In countless apartments, radios crackled with news broadcasts that, for players, contained not just information about the wider world, but also the figures from which the next day's winning numbers would be derived. Against this backdrop, Coppola's personal life remained deliberately murky. Public records indicate that by the late 1930s he was firmly rooted in New York, with a residence that kept him within easy reach of the territories he helped supervise. He did not seek flamboyant displays of wealth. Unlike some gangsters who flaunted expensive suits and nightlife, Coppola gained a reputation among investigators as reserved, nearly cautious in public. His wealth showed up more in the stability he could afford, reliable housing, steady access to cash, and the ability to support relatives than in ostentatious purchases. As his influence grew, so did official attention. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who took office in 1934, made fighting organized crime and illegal gambling a key part of his administration. He smashed slot machines in vote-ready raids and pressed the police to crack down on policy games. Newspapers carried stories of raids on Harlem apartments where betting slips were seized by the sackful. Yet for every storefront shut down, another seemed to open nearby. The very simplicity of the numbers game made it incredibly resilient. It required no machinery, only trust and routine. Faced with the difficulty of proving gambling charges against insulated figures like Coppola, authorities increasingly turned to other legal tools, especially tax law and vagrancy statutes. If prosecutors could not easily tie a mob figure to specific bets or extortion demands, they could ask a different question. How did this person, with no obvious legitimate income, support his lifestyle? Why were his tax returns incomplete or inconsistent with visible spending? These strategies would later play a central role in national efforts against organized crime, but New York officials were already experimenting with them in the late 1930s. Coppola learned to adapt. He kept his name off leases and business registrations when possible, conducted sensitive meetings in discreet locations, and communicated orders through intermediaries. Within the Genovese family, his work on the numbers rackets won him protection and, by most expert accounts, promotion. He was no longer simply a gunman. He had become what mob terminology called a capo, or at least a trusted lieutenant, responsible for managing both people and money in a major revenue stream. Yet the very success of Harlem's numbers enterprise guaranteed that pressure would continue to build. Reformers, journalists, and some police officials argued that illegal gambling drained wealth from already struggling communities and fueled corruption that reached into city government. They might not have known Michael Coppola by sight, but when they talked about the men who sat on top of the policy racket, they were, in effect, talking about people like him. As the 1930s drew to a close, and the world edged toward another global war, Coppola's position at the heart of New York's illegal gambling economy was firmly established. The boy from Calabria who had grown up in crowded East Harlem tenements now sat near the apex of a complex, racially and economically entangled business that touched tens of thousands of lives every day. Outside, bread lines shortened a bit as the economy slowly improved. Inside, in back rooms and social clubs, ledgers were still being tallied, bets still being collected, and decisions still being made about who would be rewarded, who would be overlooked, and who would be left to face the law when the next raid came. When the Second World War broke out in Europe in 1939, and then drew the United States in after Pearl Harbor, New York changed again, but less drastically than the headlines suggested. Shipyards boomed, factories expanded, and Harlem streets filled with uniforms, black soldiers on leave, Italian-American draftees coming home between assignments, sailors crowding bars on weekend nights. Ration cards appeared in kitchen drawers, victory gardens sprang up in vacant lots. Yet under the surface stir of wartime patriotism, the familiar routines of the numbers game carried on, almost untouched. For the policy racket, war was less an interruption than a windfall. Wages rose in defense plants, at least for those lucky. Enough to get work. Cash moved faster through households where overtime shifts suddenly became available. At the same time, uncertainty about the future deepened. Families worried about telegrams from the War Department. They listened to nightly casualty reports and tried not to imagine familiar names among the lists. In that atmosphere, small bets, 10 cents here, a quarter there, felt like both escape and insurance. If the worst happened, maybe a hit on the numbers would cover a funeral bill, a rent payment, or a train ticket to visit a wounded son. The men who ran the numbers rackets understood this psychology intimately. It was the quiet foundation of their profits. By the early 1940s, within the reorganized Genovese crime family, gambling, especially policy, had become one of the most stable and desirable rackets. Bootlegging was fading with the end of Prohibition in 1933, and labor racketeering, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking all carried their own risks. Numbers, by contrast, required no inventory beyond paper and trust, and could be defended as a victimless vice, even though its drain on poor neighborhoods was very real. The Genovese hierarchy itself was in flux. Lucky Luciano had been convicted in 1936 on compulsory prostitution charges and imprisoned. From behind bars and later from exile in Italy, he remained a symbolic figure, but daily control passed to others. Vito Genovese, after whom the family would eventually be named, had fled to Italy in 1937 to escape prosecution for a Brooklyn murder. That left Frank Costello, Luciano's diplomatic, politically connected lieutenant, as the de facto boss in New York. Costello favored rackets that required brains and contacts more than brute force, slot machines, legitimate gambling, and behind-the-scenes influence with politicians. Numbers fit well into that portfolio. In this environment, Michael "Trigger" Mike Coppola's importance increased. He had already established himself as a reliable figure in the Harlem and Bronx gambling world in the late 1930s. Now, as the family leaned more heavily on gambling revenue, his territory and responsibilities expanded. Internal law enforcement memoranda from the period, later unearthed by crime commissions and historians, consistently list Coppola among the principal Italian overseers of policy operations north of Midtown Manhattan. Coppola did not do this work alone, nor did he appear publicly as a boss. He operated within a chain of command that linked neighborhood toughs to mid-level capos, and finally to figures like Costello at the top. But within that chain, he emerged as the key Genovese figure for East Harlem and large parts of Harlem and the Bronx. Black bankers and intermediaries still ran much of the street-level operation. Figures like Bumpy Johnson negotiated arrangements that allowed some continuity of black control in Harlem. Yet above that layer, the money moved into Italian hands, and among those hands, Coppola's were some of the most trusted. War brought both opportunity and risk. On the one hand, federal attention was focused outward, to espionage threats, sabotage, and the functioning of shipyards and docks. The Navy's quiet arrangement with Luciano to help secure New York's waterfront, while controversial, underscored how flexible the government could be when it believed national security was at stake. On the other hand, local prosecutors and the New York Police Department did not suddenly forget about vice. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, still in office until 1945, continued to make political capital out of raiding gambling operations. District attorneys in Manhattan and the Bronx used wartime rhetoric to argue that vice undermined morale and diverted precious resources. That meant Coppola's world was one of constant tension. On any given day, two very different scenes might unfold within a few blocks of each other. In one, uniformed men paraded down a Harlem avenue, bands playing, crowds waving flags, speeches extolling sacrifice and discipline. In another, in a tenement hallway or a candy store's back room, a policy writer quietly totaled the day's bets, his pencil moving swiftly over columns of numbers, ears alert for the slightest sound of police entering the building. When raids came, they were usually directed at these lower levels. Police would burst into apartments, seize betting slips and cash, and arrest the people closest to the evidence. Writers and runners, often making only a modest living themselves, bore the brunt of enforcement. Coppola and other higher-ups were rarely present in such scenes. If they appeared in police records at all, it was in the cautious language of confidential informants. Subject is believed to control policy operations in the following precincts. Or, several arrested individuals have identified one Michael Coppola as their ultimate banker. On the political stage, voices within Harlem were divided about what should be done. Some preachers and community leaders denounced the numbers game as a parasite on the poor, draining nickels and dimes that could have gone toward food, rent, or savings. Others took a more ambivalent stance, noting that policy operators often provided emergency loans, jobs, and even charitable donations when no one else did. Because Italian overseers like Coppola remained mostly invisible, those debates focused on the black faces people saw every day, the neighborhood writer, the local banker, not on the men further up the ladder who took a quiet share of every bet. For Coppola, whose own childhood had been spent in immigrant poverty, the parallels must have been hard to miss. He had grown up in a world where informal economies, legal and illegal, existed side by side. Now, in middle age, he was one of the architects of such a system for another community that occupied a similarly marginal position in American life. Whether he saw this as exploitation, savvy business, or simply the way of the world is unknowable. What is clear is that, by the early 1940s, he had mastered the art of making himself indispensable and elusive at the same time. Newspaper archives from the wartime years show his name only intermittently, often in small crime notes buried far from the front page. He was picked up on suspicion of gambling, or on vague vagrancy charges that police sometimes used as a pretext when they lacked solid evidence of a specific offense. In these appearances, he is usually described as a suspected policy kingpin, an alleged numbers boss, or a reputed racketeer. The language underscores both law enforcement's belief in his importance and their frustration at being unable to pin a serious conviction on him. One of the few tools authorities had in dealing with men like Coppola was the grand jury. Prosecutors could subpoena suspected racketeers to testify about their income, associations, or specific incidents. Refusal to answer could lead to contempt charges. Yet in practice, these proceedings often produced little. Like many of his peers, Coppola either invoked his constitutional rights against self-incrimination or claimed ignorance, insisting he was a legitimate businessman with no knowledge of illegal gambling. The code of silence that governed mafia behavior, omerta, was not just a cultural ideal. It was a survival strategy tested repeatedly in these rooms. The war ended in 1945 with celebrations that spilled into the same streets that had long been policy territory. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians danced and drank. Church bells rang. People hugged strangers on corners where only hours before, bets had been quietly passed from hand to hand. In the short term, the end of the war brought optimism. GIs returned with the prospect of the GI Bill, home loans, and college opportunities. Factories retooled for peacetime goods. But the structural inequities that had fed the numbers racket did not disappear. In Harlem and East Harlem, discrimination in employment and housing remained harsh. For many families, the numbers game continued to function as a shadow banking system and a daily habit. In the late 1940s, scrutiny of organized crime began to sharpen again, now framed less as a matter of wartime morality and more as a question of corruption and public order. In New York, Mayor William O'Dwyer and Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan took up the banner of reform. They commissioned studies, reorganized vice squads, and promised to go after not just the small-time gamblers but the big shots behind them. It was in reports produced in this era that Michael Coppola's name started to appear with greater frequency and confidence. Internal police lists of suspected organized crime leaders, some of which would later be cited by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and other agencies, consistently placed Coppola among the top figures in the Genovese family's gambling operations. He was described as the policy boss of Harlem and the Bronx, the man to whom many smaller operators ultimately reported or paid tribute. These assessments were based on patterns observed over years, the same names recurring in informant statements, the flow of money uphill from busted policy banks, and the quiet influence Coppola seemed to wield in choosing who could operate where. His personal life intersected with his underworld reputation in ways that further darkened his public image. In the late 1940s, a domestic tragedy brought his name onto front pages in a way that routine gambling arrests never had. His wife died from a gunshot wound in their home, an event that immediately raised suspicions, given his nickname and known background. Police questioned him extensively, explored the possibility of foul play, and probed the couple's relationship. In the end, the death was officially classified in a way that did not lead to charges against him, and Coppola walked free. Yet the case lingered in public memory and in the private assessments of detectives. Reporters alluded to it in later stories as an example of the violence associated with his name. even when the legal record remained technically clean. For law enforcement officers who already believed that he had ordered or committed acts of violence in the underworld, the unresolved questions around his wife's death reinforced their conviction that the courts had seen only a small fraction of his true conduct. Even as his notoriety grew, Coppola maintained his preference for the shadows. He did not cultivate celebrity, as some gangsters did. He avoided nightclubs that drew society photographers, stayed away from high-profile trials where testimony might drag his name into public dispute, and kept his appearances at social clubs discreet. Within East Harlem and the Bronx, people who needed to know who he was knew. To outsiders, he was far from a household name in the way of a Luciano or, later, a Costello. But in the specialized world of vice squads, investigative journalists, and underworld insiders, Trigger Mike had become shorthand for a particular slice of New York's illegal economy. On the streets, the human toll of that economy remained mostly invisible in official discussions. Families who spent small but regular sums on numbers bets often found themselves short at the end of the week. Women sometimes pawned jewelry to cover losses. Men borrowed from informal lenders at punishing interest rates. When a big hit did occur, stories spread quickly. A janitor who paid off his debts, a seamstress who bought new furniture, a church that received an anonymous donation. These stories helped sustain belief in the game's fairness and possibility, even though, over time, the house always won. For the Genovese family, and for Coppola personally, the numbers racket's greatest strength was its embeddedness in community life. Unlike a brazen daylight robbery or a sensational murder, policy was a quiet presence. It operated on trust, routine, and the reluctance of ordinary people to view themselves as victims. Many players did not see the men above their local writer as predators. They barely thought about them at all. That allowed someone like Coppola to accumulate wealth and influence without drawing constant public ire. Still, a shift was coming. In the late 1940s, a series of national scandals involving unions, gambling, and political corruption began to change how Americans thought about organized crime. Journalists wrote exposés on the reach of underworld money into city halls and state houses. Magazine articles depicted syndicates that crossed state lines and ethnic boundaries. Increasingly, the numbers racket was mentioned not as a harmless neighborhood diversion, but as one piece of a much larger criminal mosaic. In New York, investigators began to share information more systematically with federal agencies. Patterns that had once been visible only at the local level now stood out in broader relief. When agents and detectives mapped the networks of policy operations across Manhattan, Harlem, and the Bronx, certain nodes appeared again and again. Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola was one of those nodes, never at the center of every line, but close enough, often enough, to mark him as a key figure. By the end of the decade, his position seemed paradoxically secure and precarious. Inside the Genovese family, he was a proven earner, a man who had turned Harlem's and the Bronx's collective hopes and desperation into steady streams of cash. That kind of reliability earned protection. Outside, in the world of law enforcement and politics, he had become a symbol of the very thing reformers said they wanted to dismantle. The hidden, ruthless power brokers who profited from vice while leaving others to bear the visible risks. The next phase of his life would pull him from the relative obscurity of precinct memos and grand jury rooms into the harsher light of national attention. Senators, television cameras, and headline writers would soon turn the careful, layered secrecy of the numbers racket into a public spectacle. For Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola, who had spent decades hunting the art of staying just out of focus, the post-war campaign against organized crime would test how long a man in his position could continue to operate in the shadows, once the country decided it wanted to see who, exactly, was sitting behind the ledgers and the telephone lines. They watched him on living room sets the size of suitcases, the image wavering in black and white. In kitchens and barbershops and corner bars across America, Frank Costello's hands trembled on television screens as senators pressed him about his income, his friends, his influence. For the first time, the shadowy world of the syndicate was not just whispered about in newspapers. It was performed, however reluctantly, under glaring lights. The Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950 and 1951 turned organized crime into a national spectacle. The camera framed mobsters as public enemies, or to some fascinated viewers as dark celebrities. For men who had thrived on staying invisible, it was a dangerous new era. Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola understood that danger keenly. He had spent 2 decades building power in a realm that rarely landed on the front page, the daily numbers bets of Harlem and the Bronx. His name was known to detectives and policy runners, but not to most of the people who placed their dimes on 3-digit combinations before work. Now, as senators railed against interstate crime syndicates and reporters searched for faces to match the word mafia, that carefully maintained anonymity came under sustained threat. The Kefauver Committee, the U.S. Senate Special Committee to investigate organized crime and interstate commerce, held hearings in cities across the country: Miami, New Orleans, Chicago, St. Louis, New York. Its New York sessions in early 1951 were especially electric. Costello, the Genovese family's de facto boss, testified in a tightly controlled appearance. Cameras were allowed to show only his hands and torso, not his face, but the effect was still powerful. Watching his fingers fidget and his voice strain under questioning, millions of Americans saw for the first time how closely their city's respectable institutions were tied to gambling and vice. Costello spoke of gambling as his business, as if it were no worse than running a chain of clothing stores. That word hung in the air. For investigators, gambling meant, among other things, the very racket that was Coppola's domain. Internal law enforcement briefings that fed into the committee's work repeatedly pointed toward Harlem and the Bronx policy banks, and toward the Genovese family's role in harvesting their profits. They did not always name Coppola publicly, but his presence was felt in the background of the questions. Who controlled the numbers? Where did the money go after it left the hands of neighborhood writers? In response to Kefauver and the publicity he generated, state and local officials in New York were under pressure to show that they, too, were serious about tackling organized crime. Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan and other prosecutors convened their own grand juries. New York's legislative leaders sponsored special commissions to study rackets. Police brass ordered renewed crackdowns on policy operations. The soft underbelly of the numbers game, its dependence on stationary local spots like candy stores and newsstands, made it vulnerable to raids. For Coppola, this meant a shift from the comfortable rhythms he had enjoyed in the 1940s. The business could still function, but it had to adapt. More of the day-to-day work moved into private apartments and mobile setups. Some writers carried their pads from building to building instead of waiting behind a counter. Runners became more careful about how they transported slips and cash, changing routes often, watching for unmarked cars. The central banks, where records and money were tallied, rotated locations more frequently. Even so, arrests continued. The police swept up dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small-time operatives each year. Those arrests rarely reached Coppola's level, but the paper trail they created fed into broader investigations. When detectives booked a policy writer, one of the first questions they asked was, "Who do you work for?" Most kept silent or named only their immediate supervisors. Occasionally, either through pressure or hope of leniency, someone would point a few rungs up the ladder. Again and again, in precinct notes and prosecutors' files, the same handful of higher names appeared. Trigger Mike was one of them. At the same time, events within Harlem's own underworld were changing the balance of power. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, who had long acted as a key black intermediary and power broker in the numbers business, was indicted on narcotics charges in the early 1950s. He was convicted and sent to federal prison, a blow to the ability of Harlem-based operators to negotiate on equal terms with the Italians. With Johnson removed from the streets for a decade, figures like Coppola faced even less organized resistance from within the black community to their control of the numbers revenue. On the personal front, the late 1940s had already brought scandal and loss to Coppola's household. The sudden death of his wife by gunshot in their home had drawn intense attention from detectives and the press. He was interrogated at length. Newspapers floated dark insinuations, reflecting the public's association of his nickname with violence. Ultimately, the authorities did not charge him. The case was closed without a homicide indictment. Legally, he emerged unscathed. In the public imagination, however, the episode became part of his legend, another piece of circumstantial evidence that the polite, soft-spoken man moving through East Harlem streets carried more menace than his reserved manner suggested. Perhaps in reaction to that scrutiny, Coppola's public demeanor became even more cautious in the early 1950s. He favored low-key restaurants and private social clubs over the more ostentatious venues where detectives and reporters watched for known racketeers. He continued to avoid photography whenever possible. If he had to appear at a police station or courthouse, he did so in plain, dark suits, flanked by attorneys, his expression controlled, offering little more than brief denials in response to shouted questions. The legal pressure, however, was not just theatrical. By the early 1950s, federal authorities were taking a greater interest in the financial side of gambling. Inspired in part by the successful prosecution of Al Capone for tax evasion 2 decades earlier, prosecutors and Internal Revenue Service agents began examining whether suspected racketeers were reporting anywhere near their true income. They scrutinized bank deposits, property purchases, and expenditures, looking for discrepancies that could sustain an indictment even when witnesses were scarce. Coppola's situation made him a natural target for this strategy. He had no visible legitimate business commensurate with the lifestyle investigators believed he maintained. He was not seen clocking into a factory or running a storefront company, yet informants insisted that large sums passed through his hands. In the early 1950s, federal prosecutors brought income tax charges against him, accusing him of concealing substantial earnings from his policy operations. Contemporary news accounts describe an indictment that covered several years of returns and alleged that he had significantly underreported his true income. In court, the government's task was to translate the amorphous world of street betting into the hard numbers and documents required for conviction. Agents testified about surveillance, counting visits from known runners to apartments linked to Coppola. They introduced evidence of cash purchases and bank transactions that, in their view, could not be reconciled with his declared income. Defense attorneys countered that the case was built on conjecture and unreliable informers. They painted Coppola as a modest man hounded by overzealous officials, and insisted that whatever extra cash he had access to came from loans, gifts, or small-scale investments, not from leading a criminal syndicate. Juries in such cases were often skeptical of both sides. They knew, from the drumbeat of headlines, that organized crime was real, and that its figures rarely signed their names to incriminating documents. At the same time, they could see that many of the government's claims rested on inference rather than direct evidence. In Coppola's case, the prosecution ultimately secured a conviction on at least some of the tax counts. He was sentenced to a term in federal prison and fined, punishment that, while less severe than a murder or racketeering conviction would have been, still marked a significant escalation from the short local jail stays that had defined his earlier encounters with the law. For a man accustomed to operating in the relative freedom of New York streets and social clubs, federal custody was a jarring change. Yet prisons in that era housed many men like Coppola, gamblers, bootleggers, and union fixers who saw their sentences less as moral reckonings than as occupational hazards. Behind bars, mob hierarchies often persisted in reduced form. Messages moved through visiting rooms and coded letters, Alliances were maintained. Sometimes new ones were forged. Coppola's absence from New York did not cause the numbers business to collapse. On the contrary, its very resilience was part of what made it so attractive to his superiors. Capable lieutenants stepped in to keep collections, payouts, and protections running smoothly. The basic machinery, writers, runners, policy banks, remained in place. For many bettors, little changed. They placed their wagers with the same neighborhood figures they had always dealt with, unaware that further up the chain, one of the men taking a share of their losses was temporarily away in a federal institution. When Coppola returned to the outside world after serving his sentence, he came back to a city both familiar and altered. In Harlem and the Bronx, demographic shifts were underway. White ethnic families, including many Italians, were moving to outlying neighborhoods and suburbs aided by post-war housing policies and the GI Bill. In their place, more African American and Puerto Rican families were crowding into aging housing stock. Jobs were again becoming scarcer, especially for workers who faced discrimination or lacked advanced education. The conditions that had fed the growth of the numbers game in the 1920s and 1930s were, in many ways, repeating themselves in a new generation. On the law enforcement side, experience and technology had advanced. Police and prosecutors were experimenting with wiretaps and more systematic use of informers. The FBI, which under J. Edgar Hoover had long downplayed the existence of a national crime syndicate, began paying closer attention to organized crime after the Apalachin Summit of 1957, when state troopers stumbled upon a mafia gathering in rural upstate New York. That event was still a few years away when Coppola walked out of prison, but the ground was already shifting. The presumption that discreet men could simply resume business as usual after a few years away was increasingly risky. Within the Genovese family, leadership evolutions also affected Coppola's role. Frank Costello, rattled by an assassination attempt in 1957 and hammered by legal troubles, gradually ceded control. Vito Genovese, having returned from Italy and maneuvered against his rivals, asserted himself more forcefully at the top. As bosses changed, so did the distribution of power among capos and crews. In East Harlem, another figure, Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, was rising. Salerno, like Coppola, had deep roots in the neighborhood and a talent for managing gambling operations. Over time, he would become publicly identified as the 116th Street Crew's leader and a dominant numbers boss. In the mid-1950s, though, Coppola was still a central player. Law enforcement dossiers from these years continued to describe him as a key figure in Harlem and Bronx policy, even after his prison stint. He had not been pushed aside, but he was now part of an older guard facing both external pressure and internal generational change. Younger men watched how he navigated the new landscape, how he met with associates in more secure locations, how he kept his distance from the day-to-day handling of cash, how he relied on attorneys to interpose themselves between him and investigators. The human reality on the ground remained stubbornly similar. Each morning and afternoon, numbers writers quietly did their rounds. In apartment kitchens, on factory floors during breaks, outside subway stations, people handed over coins and bills, recited their chosen digits, and received slips in return. Children, watching from the sidelines, learned who in the building took bets and which figures on the racing page or in the stock listings mattered for the next day's draw. Some would grow up to avoid the game. Others would be drawn into its orbit as runners or writers themselves. For civic reformers and religious leaders who opposed gambling, men like Coppola became emblematic of a broader failure. They pointed out that while writers and runners went to jail and their families struggled, the upper tiers of the operation lived relatively comfortably, often insulated from the concrete consequences of raids. Editorials called for tougher laws that would make bosses directly liable for the activities of their underlings. Some proposed legalizing and regulating gambling to undercut illegal operators. Others argued for more social services, job programs, and educational support to attack the root causes that made the numbers so appealing. Coppola did not engage in those policy debates. His world was pragmatic, not philosophical. The game existed. People wanted to play. He and his associates provided the means. When police made serious inroads into one area, he shifted emphasis to another. If a particular precinct's commanders proved incorruptible, he directed operations to more hospitable jurisdictions. Where he could cultivate relationships with local politicians, ward healers, or business owners, he did, seeing such ties as a form of insurance. Yet no amount of quiet maneuvering could wholly erase the trail he had left over the years. By the mid-1950s, Trigger Mike Coppola had become, in the minds of New York's anti-crime officials, one of the archetypal figures of the city's gambling underworld. Not flamboyant like some, but emblematic of a certain hard, enduring core of organized crime. His early life in Calabria and East Harlem, his rise through prohibition gunwork, his long tenure in the policy racket, his brushes with the law and brief imprisonment, all of it combined into a profile that would draw ever closer scrutiny as the decade wore on. The country's attention, once captivated by the Kefauver spectacle and then briefly turned to other Cold War concerns, would swing back to organized crime with renewed force before long. When it did, investigators and legislators would not confine themselves to glittering Las Vegas casinos or notorious national bosses. They would again trace the flow of everyday gambling money in cities like New York, following the lines that ran up from kitchen tables and corner stores to the quiet apartments and social clubs where men like Michael, Trigger Mike, Coppola had spent so many years counting other people's hopes in dollars and cents. By the mid-1950s, the streets where Michael Trigger Mike Coppola had made his name were caught between two eras. On the surface, post-war prosperity seemed to be everywhere. New appliances glowed in department store windows, television antennae sprouted from rooftops, and glossy magazines promised that anyone could join the swelling suburban middle class. But the neighborhoods that had fed Coppola's rise, East Harlem, much of Harlem proper, large stretches of the Bronx, were not the ones featured in those carefully staged advertisements. There, overcrowded tenements still leaned into one another, factories hummed and then began to close, and the most dependable business in many blocks remained the daily ritual of the numbers game. For Coppola, now in his mid-50s, this was both a familiar landscape and a more treacherous one. He had spent decades building and consolidating control over policy betting in Harlem and the Bronx under the umbrella of the Genovese crime family. He had survived prohibition, the Depression, wartime crackdowns, a high-profile domestic tragedy, and a federal tax case that sent him to prison and back. Each challenge had forced him to adjust, but had not dislodged him from his position near the top of one of New York's most profitable illegal enterprises. Yet the attention of law enforcement and the public was sharpening in ways that made the old methods of staying in the shadows less reliable. Part of that shift came from events far from East 116th Street. In November 1957, state troopers stumbled upon a gathering in the small town of Apalachin in upstate New York. At the rural home of a local mobster, dozens of high-ranking figures from across the country had converged for what appeared to be a national conference of organized crime leaders. When police descended on the property, many of the men fled into the surrounding fields and woods, only to be rounded up or identified through abandoned cars and hurried statements. The image of expensively dressed men in muddy shoes, caught by surprise in the countryside, shattered the long-standing official fiction that there was no such thing as a unified American mafia. Coppola was not among the arrested at Apalachin. His name does not appear in the rolls of those detained. But the consequences of that afternoon reached into his world all the same. In the months that followed, congressional investigators, federal agencies, and state commissions suddenly had the political cover to say openly what many detectives and reporters had privately believed for years: that New York's Italian crime families formed part of a broader, structured national network. They began assembling charts and lists, mapping not only bosses and underbosses, but also the lieutenants who controlled specific rackets in each city. On those internal diagrams, the line that ran from Genovese family to numbers gambling, Harlem Bronx, almost invariably ended at Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola. He had kept his face out of newspapers more successfully than some of his contemporaries, but inside law enforcement circles, he had long since lost the privilege of anonymity. Memoranda circulated between city and state offices describing him as the man who controlled the policy racket north of 96th Street, the top figure in Harlem numbers, or the principal Genovese representative in Harlem gambling. The national mood was changing in other ways as well. The same decade that celebrated cheerful suburban television families also made a spectacle of corruption. The Kefauver hearings had introduced Americans to the idea that organized crime was not just neighborhood thuggery, but an economic and political force. The McClellan Committee, beginning in 1957 under Senator John McClellan with Robert F. Kennedy as its chief counsel, went after labor racketeering and, in the process, exposed still more links between unions, politicians, and underworld organizations. In this climate, local district attorneys and police commissioners felt compelled to show that they, too, were serious about going after the upper layers of the rackets. Numbers gambling, once dismissed by some officials as a minor vice, came under particular scrutiny because of its visibility in poor neighborhoods and the ease with which it could be used to illustrate the reach of the syndicate. It was one thing to talk about hidden agreements in distant boardrooms. It was another to point to a candy store on the corner and say, "The money that passes through here every day goes up to men like Frank Costello and Michael Coppola." Reformers seized on that image. Newspaper series traced the path of a dime bet from a Harlem apartment to a Bronx bank, to a ledger in an East Harlem walk-up, and then, through a haze of informants' testimony and investigative inference, to the pockets of Italian mob lieutenants. In New York, Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan led several major efforts to convert such diagrams into indictments. Using conspiracy statutes, he sought to charge not just the writers caught with slips in their pockets, but also the men believed to be organizing the entire system. In the late 1950s, Hogan's office announced large grand jury investigations into the policy racket, some of which resulted in sweeping indictments that named dozens of defendants. Contemporary press reports, while sometimes imprecise, consistently place Coppola among the top figures targeted in these campaigns, described as a central conspirator in the illegal lottery operations that stretched across Harlem and the Bronx. Bringing a man like Coppola to trial, however, was never straightforward. The very structure of the numbers business insulated upper layers from direct contact with the visible acts of gambling. Writers had stacks of bet slips, runners had envelopes of cash, mid-level controllers had coded ledgers. At the highest levels, there were conversations, agreements, and handoffs, but rarely anything as concrete as a signature on a policy sheet. Prosecutors had to build their cases from patterns: frequent meetings between known gamblers and Coppola, sudden shifts in territory after his visits, informants who swore that their bosses answered to him. Defense attorneys attacked these patterns as speculation. They pointed out that many witnesses were themselves under indictment or hopping for leniency. They emphasized that their client had already served time on a prior tax conviction and had the right to rebuild his life without being hounded whenever the district attorney wanted a headline. In courtroom exchanges preserved in news accounts, lawyers objected to questions that attempted to link Coppola to unnamed associates, insisting on specifics the state often could not provide. As the legal theater played out in Lower Manhattan, the day-to-day operation of the numbers game continued in Harlem, and the Bronx with only minor adjustments. Writers learned to recognize vice squad officers on sight. Some began using small code books so that the slips they carried would not obviously display three-digit bets. Policy banks rotated locations more frequently, and money moved even more quickly up the chain to reduce the amount that could be seized in any single raid. For bettors, the changes were largely invisible. The familiar faces still appeared each morning or afternoon to take their wagers, and the winning numbers were still announced through the same whispered networks and radio references. Inside the Genovese family, meanwhile, personnel and power were shifting. Vito Genovese, having reasserted himself at the top, was steering the organization in a harder, more centralized direction. Men who had come up under Luciano and Costello's more diplomatic style faced new expectations and rivalries. In East Harlem, Anthony, Fat Tony Salerno, a heavy-set, convivial man with a talent for bridge building, was rising quickly. Salerno operated out of the Palma Boys Social Club on East 115th Street, and like Coppola before him, built his influence through control of gambling and bookmaking. For a time, Coppola and Salerno's spheres overlapped, with both associated in various investigative reports with policy operations in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. Age, however, was drawing a line between them. By the end of the 1950s, Coppola was approaching 60. He had been part of the Underworld since Prohibition. His nickname still carried an echo of the gunman's reputation he had forged in his youth. Salerno, though not young in any ordinary sense, represented the next wave of leadership. Men whose criminal careers had begun when the Commission and the five-family structure were already in place, and who were more attuned to the post-Kefauver, post-Apalachin environment. The external pressure on Coppola became more personal as state-level crime commissions, emboldened by Apalachin, began calling individual suspected racketeers to testify in public hearings. These commissions, created by governors and legislatures, were designed to dramatize the fight against organized crime and to gather information outside the traditional grand jury process. Subpoenaed witnesses were asked about their incomes, their business interests, and their associations with other known figures. Televised sessions showed stone-faced men repeating variations of the same phrase. I refuse to answer on the grounds that my answer may tend to incriminate me. Coppola was among those summoned in this period to answer questions about gambling and his role in Harlem's numbers operations. True to the unwritten code that governed men in his position, he offered little. He denied being a boss, portrayed himself as a small businessman and gambler at most, and invoked his constitutional rights when questions approached anything substantive. His stonewalling frustrated commission lawyers and delighted headline writers, who used his nickname to frame stories about Trigger Mike Clams Up or Number King Silent on rackets. Refusing to cooperate carried risks. Commissions and courts could, and sometimes did, hold recalcitrant witnesses in contempt. Short jail stays for contempt or for minor offenses like disorderly conduct and vagrancy became almost routine for some mob figures, who treated them as brief occupational interruptions. For older men like Coppola, however, each term behind bars, no matter how brief, underscored the narrowing of their options. The combination of age, medical concerns, and intensifying focus from law enforcement made the life he had maintained through careful discretion more difficult to sustain. Within the Genovese family's leadership, these developments prompted practical considerations. High-profile investigations brought unwanted heat not only on the individuals named, but also on the entire organization. A capo whose name appeared too often in newspapers or commission transcripts, and who drew a swarm of detectives to every place he was rumored to visit, could become a liability, no matter how much money he had earned in the past. The solution in such cases was rarely dramatic. There was no public dismissal. There were no formal retirement parties. Instead, responsibilities were quietly shifted, territories reassigned, and the man at the center of the scrutiny was encouraged and eventually expected to step back. This is, by most credible accounts, what began to happen to Michael Coppola at the end of the 1950s. As the New York State authorities homed in on the Harlem and Bronx numbers rackets, his role as the visible target of their efforts made him less attractive as the day-to-day manager of those same operations. Younger or less well-known figures, including Salerno, took on more of the active role in directing collections, resolving territorial disputes, and meeting with intermediaries from Harlem's black gambling community. Coppola's influence did not disappear overnight. Decades of relationships and knowledge could not be erased so easily, but it gradually moved further from the front lines. Outside the underworld, the neighborhoods he had helped to shape through his control of illegal gambling were themselves changing in ways that added to the tension. Urban renewal projects cut into Harlem and East Harlem, destroying blocks of housing and businesses in the name of progress, often without providing adequate replacement. Public housing towers rose, altering the physical landscape and concentrating poverty in new forms. At the same time, a steady flow of heroin began to course through the streets, bringing a new kind of addiction and violence that differed sharply from the older, almost ritualized world of the numbers game. Community leaders who had once debated the merits and harms of policy now faced crises that made those arguments feel almost quaint. Ministers and activists working with young people spoke less about the temptations of betting and more about the ravages of narcotics, the lack of jobs, and the growing sense of abandonment. In that shifting moral and social economy, someone like Coppola occupied a strange position. He was both a symbol of the old order, a man who had made a fortune siphoning coins and bills from the pockets of Harlem residents, and a fatting figure, his power eroded by age, politics, and a new generation of criminals with different priorities. Law enforcement, however, was not inclined to view him as a relic. Into the early 1960s, his name persisted in police intelligence files and federal organized crime surveys as a significant, if somewhat retired, policy boss. Agents compiling background reports on the Genovese family still listed him, often with cautious qualifiers. Reputed former Harlem policy leader, believed to retain interest in numbers operations. Associates now include. These reports did not always distinguish sharply between current operational control and lingering influence, but they ensured that his movements remained of interest. Increasingly, those movements led away from New York. Like many older mob figures whose names had become too familiar to local authorities, Coppola began spending more time in Florida, which in those years served as a kind of informal retirement zone for men from the northeastern underworld. Florida cities offered warm weather, growing real estate markets, and at least for a time, somewhat less concentrated attention from New York's specialized anti-racketeering units. To law enforcement, this migration was hardly invisible. Crime reports of the period often mention clusters of known racketeers relocating south. But the distance from Harlem's precinct houses did change the rhythm of daily encounters with investigators and reporters. He did not vanish overnight. Even as he spent more time away, he remained in contact with old allies, kept up with news from the streets where he had once been a constant presence, and, according to some informants, continued to receive a quiet share of profits from the numbers areas he had helped develop. But the center of gravity was shifting decisively. In Harlem and the Bronx, the face of Italian control over the policy racket was now more often that of Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno, and other rising Genovese figures. For younger gamblers and police officers alike, Trigger Mike was becoming less a day-to-day adversary and more a legendary name, still uttered with respect or resentment, but increasingly associated with an earlier chapter. Yet the legacy of his choices remained embedded in the fabric of the city. The structures he had helped perfect, the layered chains of writers, runners, and bankers, the coded ledgers, the silent understandings between Italian overseers and black neighborhood intermediaries, The calibrated use of payoffs and intimidation continued to shape illegal gambling long after his own role diminished. In that sense, even as he withdrew from the front lines under mounting pressure, the imprint of Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola on New York's underground economy endured, woven into the daily bets and whispered names that still pass through Harlem stairwells and Bronx barbershops with the same worn inevitability as they had when he was a young enforcer, just beginning to understand how much money and power could be found in 3 simple digits scribbled on a slip of paper. The humid light of a Florida afternoon, Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola looked less like the hard-edged enforcer his nickname suggested, and more like what he technically was by then, an aging man who had been in one dangerous line of work for a very long time. He spent increasing stretches of the late 1950s and early 1960s in and around Miami, walking through lobbies of modest hotels and apartment houses, meeting a small circle of visitors in coffee shops and on shaded patios. To the untrained eye, he might have passed for a retired shopkeeper or tradesman from New York. To detectives from Dade County and federal agents briefed on who he was, his presence in Florida was anything but ordinary. They knew his file by heart. Born 1900, Calabria, Italy, immigrated as a child, grew up in East Harlem, prohibition gunman, numbers boss of Harlem and the Bronx under the Genovese crime family, prior federal tax conviction, questioned in connection with his wife's suspicious death, named again and again in New York City and state investigations as a key figure in the policy racket. Now, they noted, he seemed to be retired in Florida on no clearly documented legitimate income. That pattern was familiar. The state was filling up with northeastern mob figures who had made their money elsewhere and come south in middle or old age, hopping the warmth, and a change of scenery would help them outlast their enemies and the law. His distance from New York, however, did not mean distance from scrutiny. In Washington, the shock of the Apalachin meeting had forced J. Edgar Hoover's FBI to abandon its long-standing public skepticism about a nationwide mafia. Under pressure from Congress and the Kennedy Justice Department, the Bureau launched what it called the Top Hoodlum Program, assigning agents in field offices across the country to compile detailed information on the leading organized crime figures in their districts. New York City agents dutifully entered names that local detectives had been repeating for years: bosses, underbosses, capos, and specialized operatives. Among the names that went into those early lists was Michael Coppola. The FBI's files on him were a patchwork of earlier New York intelligence reports, tax records, arrest sheets, and the occasional raw note from an informant. They described him as the principal Italian figure in Harlem's numbers gambling for at least 2 decades, a man who had once personally enforced orders with a gun, and who now, by most accounts, delegated such work to others. His move to Florida did not remove him from those files. It simply led to a second set of entries in Miami and Tampa field offices, subject believed to be retired, but still maintains contacts with Genovese's family. Associates include other known hoodlums from New York, keeps low profile, rarely appears in public places frequented by tourists. Back in New York, the business he had helped mold into a quiet empire did not pause. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, the numbers game remained a fixture of life in Harlem, East Harlem, and the Bronx. In many households, it was part of the daily routine, as ordinary as morning coffee or a newspaper. People now watched television instead of radio for the closing stock numbers or racing results from which the winning digits were derived, but the underlying practice was unchanged. A housewife picking up groceries might stop to play her age and her child's birthday. A hospital orderly might pick the address of the building where he worked. Tiny sums flowed upward, day after day, as they had since the 1920s. The control above that level, however, was evolving. With Vito Genovese imprisoned on federal narcotics charges in 1959, the Genovese family entered a period of decentralized leadership. A panel of senior figures, including Thomas Eboli, Gerardo Catina, and Philip, Benny Squint Lombardo, was believed by investigators to be sharing power. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, heavily involved in East Harlem gambling, was emerging as a visible front boss, a man law enforcement could point to, while the more cautious and strategic Lombardo stayed largely in the shadows. Within this reconfigured hierarchy, Coppola's old domain was now more formally associated with Salerno and the 116th Street crew. The shift was not abrupt. It had been building for years as Coppola attracted more attention and age limited his appetite for daily confrontation. But the early 1960s made the new order unmistakable. New York State's Commission of Investigation, created in 1958, began holding hearings that focused specifically on the numbers racket. When the commission's lawyers and investigators laid out charts of who ran what, it was Salerno. They identified as the active head of the Harlem Policy Syndicate, even as they continued to refer to Coppola as a significant former leader who still had interests in the business. The commission wanted Coppola's testimony precisely because he bridged those two eras. In the early 1960s, he was subpoenaed to appear before investigators to answer questions about his finances, his relationships with known gamblers, and his role in Harlem and Bronx numbers. He traveled north from Florida under escort, confronted not on the streets by vice squads, but in airless hearing rooms by lawyers determined to break through the code of silence that had stymied so many previous inquiries. Seated under the flat glare of overhead lights, he presented the same careful demeanor he had shown grand juries and prosecutors in earlier decades. He acknowledged his name and basic biographical details, but when the questions turned to his alleged leadership of policy operations or his associations with specific Genovese figures, he gave little. Sometimes he denied outright that he was a boss or that he controlled gambling in any neighborhood. Often, he simply refused to answer on the grounds that the response could be self-incriminating, invoking protections that the U.S. Constitution afforded him, and that mob lawyers had long ago learned to deploy as a shield. Commission members were not surprised. They had seen similar performances from other witnesses, but his recalcitrance still had consequences. Contempt citations were a real possibility, and at least once during this period, he was held in contempt for refusing to cooperate, resulting in a brief stay behind bars. For a man in his 60s, even a short jail term was no trivial matter. Still, he emerged and returned to Florida, apparently willing to trade a few days or weeks of confinement for the longer-term protection that silence provided, not just for himself, but for the people and structures that had made him rich. While these legal dramas played out, Harlem itself was entering a turbulent new chapter. The civil rights movement, which had gathered force across the South through boycotts, sit-ins, and court cases, resonated strongly in northern black neighborhoods that had long faced their own forms of segregation and discrimination. In 1964, tensions over policing and racial injustice erupted into days of unrest in Harlem after the police shooting of a black teenager. Businesses were looted or burned, clashes between residents and officers flared, and a sense of disillusionment deepened. The old storefronts that had once quietly housed numbers writers and policy banks were now sometimes the sites of smashed glass and political graffiti. In this climate, the numbers game took on a slightly different cast in public debate. To some critics, it was one more symptom of a community held down by inequality, evidence that people felt they had so little chance of advancement through legitimate means that they turned instead to long-shot bets. To others, especially older residents, it looked almost benign compared with the rapid spread of heroin that was ravaging younger generations. Policy did not typically lead to overdoses or muggings. Heroin did. Some community leaders who had denounced numbers operators for years now found themselves nostalgically recalling the days when the worst vice on their block was a quiet lottery. From the standpoint of organized crime, however, Narcotics and numbers were not so easily separated. Federal crackdowns on heroin trafficking made that business volatile. Gambling, by contrast, remained relatively steady. The Genovese family, like its counterparts, tried to keep a foothold in both, but it was gambling, including numbers, horse betting, and later sports bookmaking, that continued to supply a predictable flow of revenue. Salerno, running the 116th Street cruise operations, was deeply invested in that stability. Coppola, watching from Florida, could see the contours of an empire he had helped shape now managed in real time by his successors. Even at a distance, his name still surfaced when law enforcement pieced together the longer history of those enterprises. Agents debriefing informants in the early 1960s often asked not only about current leaders, but also about how the rackets had evolved. Older informers, especially those who had worked as runners or mid-level controllers in the 1940s and 1950s, almost always mentioned Coppola. They described how collections had once been carried to apartments associated with him, how disputes had been resolved according to his word, how his approval or disfavor could make or break a small policy bank. For younger agents just entering the field, these stories turned him into something like a foundational figure, part of the origin story of the modern Harlem numbers syndicate. Florida, for its part, was not a sanctuary free of legal conflict. The state had its own organized crime problems, particularly in cities like Miami and Tampa, where illegal gambling, loan sharking, and real estate scams thrived alongside the tourist trade. Local newspapers sometimes ran comparative pieces, noting how many former New York racketeers now held driver's licenses and property deeds in Dade County. Sheriffs and state investigators compiled their own lists of undesirable or known hoodlum residents, and Coppola's name appeared on more than one. He was occasionally stopped and questioned, his identification checked, his photograph updated in police files. But unless he was caught in the act of a new crime or formally accused of directing ongoing illegal activity from afar, there was only so much Florida authorities could do. Being a retired mob figure was not, in itself, against the law. Moreover, evidence that he still exercised direct control over New York's policy racket was thin by this point. The men and money flows that defined daily operations ran primarily through Salerno and the younger tiers of the Genovese structure. Privately, within the underworld, the way his story had turned carried a familiar lesson. The Commission, the body of bosses from the major Italian-American crime families that had emerged from Lucky Luciano's reorganization in the 1930s, had long used quiet exile as a disciplinary tool. A capo whose name brought too much police pressure, or whose personal style threatened the family's stability, could be ordered to step aside, move away, and live on whatever savings or negotiated stipend he had. Defiance of such orders was rare and carried grave risks. Compliance, while hardly voluntary in the psychological sense, at least allowed a man to grow old, something many of his peers never managed. Most observers believe that this is essentially what happened with Coppola. His legal troubles, combined with the public notoriety he had accumulated through hearings and press attention, made his continued presence at the center of the Harlem and Bronx numbers operations a liability. The solution was not an execution in a back room. It was a one-way ticket to Florida, accompanied by a clear understanding that he was to leave the running of New York's policy business to others. That he obeyed, spending his later years largely in the Sunshine State, suggests both his instinct for self-preservation and his acceptance of the unwritten rules governing life inside the mafia. In those later years, away from the blocks where his underworld identity had been forged, the contrast between the public and private narratives about him only widened. To the average New Yorker skimming newspaper headlines in the early 1960s, the names associated with organized crime in Manhattan were increasingly Costello, Genovese, and on the gambling front, Salerno. To law enforcement veterans and underworld old-timers, however, Trigger Mike, remained a shorthand for an earlier, formative phase, a time when the Italian takeover of Harlem's numbers rackets was still fresh, when the memory of Dutch Schultz's brutal incursion and violent end lingered, and when men like Coppola had climbed by combining the raw violence of prohibition gunmen with the patient bookkeeping of gambling entrepreneurs. Those dual skills had allowed him to navigate decades of shifting economic and political landscapes, but they could not insulate him forever from the passage of time. By the mid-1960s, he was in his mid-60s, an age when even the toughest street veterans found their energy waning and their ambitions narrowing. Friends and enemies alike were aging or dying. The legal and social systems that had once struggled to even name his world were now far more sophisticated, armed with new laws, investigative techniques, and a public far more aware of organized crime's existence. Yet in the hallways and stoops of Harlem, where number slips still changed hands each day, the structural realities he had exploited remained stubbornly familiar. Poverty, discrimination, and limited access to conventional credit continued to push people toward informal economies. The numbers game, now firmly under Italian control and run by men who had followed in his footsteps, still functioned both as a daily fantasy and a shadow banking system. Winning enough on a 3-digit hit could cover a month's rent or a medical bill. Losing meant cutting corners somewhere else. The flow of small bets into large, hidden profits was as steady as ever. From his vantage point in Florida, Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola could only watch, through news reports and the stories brought by visitors, as the city that had made him oscillated between upheaval and continuity. The civil rights movement, urban renewal, rising concerns over narcotics, and new waves of law enforcement attention were remaking parts of New York's landscape. But the fundamental pattern he had lived by, the ability of organized crime to entrench itself in the gaps left by economic and political inequality, remained intact. In the end, that pattern would shape not just his life but also his legacy. Even as his personal role diminished and his health began to decline, the system he had helped refine outlived him, passing seamlessly into the hands of men like Salerno. For the public, his name would eventually fade from headlines, replaced by others. For historians and investigators tracing the evolution of New York's underworld, however, Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola would remain a key link in the chain that connected the rough street gangs of the early 20th century to the sophisticated, semi-corporate criminal enterprises that dominated urban vice well into the late 20th century. A link forged in Calabrian poverty, hardened in East Harlem's tenements, and tested in courtrooms and commission hearings from Manhattan to Miami. By the early 1960s, the national conversation about organized crime had moved far beyond the scattered, embarrassed denials of earlier decades. In Washington, Robert F. Kennedy, first as chief counsel to the McClellan Committee and then as Attorney General, made the fight against the mafia a central mission. In New York, federal, state, and city agencies were learning, often awkwardly, how to coordinate long-term investigations rather than rely on sporadic raids. Wiretaps, hidden microphones, and more sophisticated use of informants were beginning to pierce the veil of secrecy that men like Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola had relied on for most of their lives. As these new tools came into play, Coppola was no longer walking Harlem streets or holding court in East 116th Street social clubs. He was living mainly in Florida, an ocean of sky and heat away from the tenements where he had built his reputation. Yet his name persisted in the internal documents that guided this new wave of enforcement. In FBI files compiled under the Top Hoodlum program, in New York State Commission of Investigation background reports, and in police intelligence summaries, he appeared again and again, not always as an active target, but as a key figure in the story investigators were piecing together about how the Genovese family had come to dominate illegal gambling in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. The 1963 testimony of Joseph Valachi, a low-ranking Genovese soldier who broke the mafia's code of silence before a U.S. Senate subcommittee, gave that story a new, public frame. Apalachin drew charts of the family structure, named bosses, and explained how crews controlled specific rackets and territories. While he focused mostly on men who were still active and on events in which he had personally taken part, his account reinforced what law enforcement had already begun to suspect: that the transformation of neighborhood gangs into stable crime families had depended on a handful of figures who combined muscle and management, violence and bookkeeping. In that light, the older intelligence about Coppola, his early work as an enforcer, his long stewardship of the Harlem and Bronx numbers, seemed less like scattered rumor and more like a missing chapter in a coherent narrative. Even if Apalachin did not dwell on him by name, the structure he described lined up closely with the patterns New York detectives had documented for years. A Genovese crew in East Harlem, control of policy gambling radiating from that base, black intermediaries in Harlem streets, Italian overseers at the top. By then, however, Coppola's personal world was shrinking. In his early 60s, he was managing the realities of age, declining energy, health concerns, the attrition of his own generation. Men he had worked with in the 1920s and 1930s were dead, imprisoned, or themselves semi-retired. The legal system, once slow and uncertain in its approach to organized crime, was now more systematic. The Justice Department's creation of the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section, the passage of new wiretap statutes, and the groundwork being laid for stronger conspiracy and racketeering laws all signaled that the era of relatively low risk, high reward criminal entrepreneurship was coming to an end. Still, law enforcement had unfinished business with him. New York State's Commission of Investigation, which had already compelled his appearance once, was not satisfied with his earlier evasions. In the early 1960s, the commission again sought his testimony as it dug deeper into the financial underpinnings of the numbers racket. For investigators, the logic was simple. If they could establish a clear line from Harlem's policy bets to specific bank accounts, real estate holdings, or investments controlled by known mob figures, they could build cases not only for gambling violations, but also for tax evasion, perjury, and conspiracy. To that end, they subpoenaed bank officers, accountants, and suspected middlemen. They pored over property records, looking for purchases by relatives or shell companies that might mask illicit profits, and they called back men like Coppola, who, in the view of commission staff, could either clarify or obstruct their understanding of how the money flowed. Once more he traveled north under legal compulsion, flying into a city that had been the stage for his life's work, but which now greeted him with the wary attention usually reserved for a returning defendant rather than a prodigal son. In hearing rooms and, at times, in private sessions closed to the public, he faced detailed questions about his sources of income, his bank relationships, and his connections to active gamblers. Once more, he refused to provide what the commission wanted. He admitted to knowing people everyone knew he knew. He acknowledged past brushes with the law that were already on the record. But when interrogators pressed him on whether he still had a financial stake in Harlem's policy operations, or whether he had ever directed specific individuals to run numbers in named precincts, he fell back on the same constitutional protections he and his peers had relied on for years. The commission responded by seeking contempt findings. In at least one instance, he was held in contempt of the body for his refusal to answer, leading to a custodial sentence that, while not lengthy, underlined the seriousness with which officials now treated such stonewalling. These were not the informal, backroom scoldings of a Tammany-era police captain. They were formal legal sanctions, backed by a judiciary increasingly willing to support aggressive investigatory tactics in the name of combating organized crime. When Coppola returned to Florida after these confrontations, he did so with his radius of freedom slightly narrowed. He remained, in theory, a freer man than many of his contemporaries who were serving long sentences for narcotics, labor racketeering, or violent crimes. Yet the mix of age, recurring legal pressure, and the underworld expectation that he maintain a low profile left him with a life that bore little resemblance to the swaggering gangster archetypes popularized in pulp novels and crime films. In Miami and its surrounding communities, he lived among a growing colony of men with similar histories, retired bookmakers, former union business agents, one-time bootleggers, and ex-policy kings, who had relocated south to enjoy what remained of their health and wealth. They gathered in small groups, often out of public view, playing cards or talking about old times. For local law enforcement, they were a headache and a curiosity. On the one hand, their pasts marked them as objects of suspicion. On the other, many seemed content to argue over horse races and boxing matches rather than orchestrate new rackets. Even so, Florida authorities did not entirely accept the narrative of harmless retirement. They tracked who met whom, shared information with counterparts in New York and Washington, and made occasional public examples of high-profile arrests when evidence warranted. Coppola's file remained active, even if new entries became less dramatic. A note about a traffic stop, a mention in an informant's report that he had been seen dining with another former figure, a passing reference in a federal compilation of known syndicate members residing in Florida. Back in Harlem and the Bronx, the numbers game itself showed no sign of retirement. The 1960s were not kind to these neighborhoods. Deindustrialization, white flight, discriminatory lending practices, and the cumulative effects of neglected housing policy deepened poverty and limited opportunity. As legal economic pathways constricted, participation in informal economies, including illegal gambling, remained widespread. A bet on the numbers was, for many residents, one of the few forms of risk they felt they could choose for themselves, rather than have imposed on them by capricious landlords, employers, or public agencies. The Genovese family, now moving further into the Lombardo, Salerno era, continued to treat numbers as a core asset. While heroin traffickers drew intense federal fire and the headlines that came with it, gambling operations generated steady cash with comparatively less attention. Salerno, who by the late 1960s was well known to law enforcement as a major bookmaker and numbers boss, ran the Harlem policy empire with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that earlier figures like Coppola had helped pioneer. The crews under him collected, counted, and redistributed money along lines that would have been instantly recognizable to his older predecessor. Law enforcement campaigns occasionally disrupted these circuits. In one widely covered operation in the mid-1960s, for example, New York City police and state investigators raided dozens of suspected policy banks in a single day, hauling in sacks of betting slips and arresting writers, runners, and mid-level controllers. Press conferences displayed tables piled with seized paraphernalia, as officials promised that the policy plague would be eradicated. But within weeks or months, the machinery quietly reassembled itself in new apartments and storefronts. So long as daily economic conditions made the numbers attractive to players and profitable to operators, the racket adapted. For Coppola, watching this cycle from afar, the continuity must have been striking. The names of the district attorneys and police commissioners had changed. The rhetoric was sharper, the legal tools more sophisticated. Yet the basic configuration of the numbers business remained what it had been since Dutch Schultz first pushed into Harlem, and was then supplanted by the Italians. Black communities providing the mass of players and much of the street-level infrastructure. Italian families controlling the upper tiers and the lion's share of the profits. That arrangement, which he had been instrumental in entrenching, outlived his direct involvement without significant alteration. By the mid-1960s, his own health was failing. Aging records and brief mentions in law enforcement notes describe him as suffering from chronic medical issues typical of a man in his 60s with a hard-lived past. He had outlasted many of the dangers that came with his occupation. He had not been assassinated in a bar, disappeared on a country road, or sentenced to die in prison, but the ordinary wear of time was asserting itself. Friends and remaining family members saw him less as the feared Trigger Mike of old police reports, and more as an older relative whose legendary stories, when he chose to share them, described a New York that younger listeners barely recognized. He died in 1966 in Dade County, Florida, by most accounts of natural causes. He was 65 years old. His passing drew some notice in the press, but not the kind of sustained attention that had accompanied the deaths of more flamboyant figures. Brief obituaries and crime columns in New York newspapers referred to him as a reputed former Harlem numbers boss, or alleged policy kingpin of the Genovese family. They reminded readers of his nickname, recounted his earlier tax conviction, and alluded to his wife's controversial death and the long-standing law enforcement belief that he had ordered or carried out acts of violence that had never been proven in court. There were no public funerals attended by ranks of underworld figures in dark suits, no widely reported processions down familiar Harlem avenues. Whatever ceremonies marked his burial were private, in keeping with the relative quiet of his final years. Within organized crime circles, his death was acknowledged but did not precipitate a power struggle. His most important practical roles had been passed on long before. In Harlem and the Bronx, the writers took bets the next morning as usual. The numbered slips still moved up through runners and bankers to reach the hands of men who, like him, were known by nicknames and whispered reputations. For law enforcement and later historians, his death became a convenient marker, a point at which they could say that one phase of the city's underworld story had definitively closed. The arc of his life traced the rise of the modern American mafia in microcosm. Born into southern Italian poverty, shaped by immigrant hardship in New York, blooded in prohibition, elevated through the takeover of a lucrative racket, battered but not broken by mid-century crime commissions and federal prosecutions, and eased into exile when his notoriety became bad for business. Yet the simplicity of that arc risked obscuring the more complicated social terrain on which it played out. Coppola's career was not just a tale of individual ambition and criminal enterprise. It was also a reflection of the structural realities of the neighborhoods he exploited. The numbers racket flourished in Harlem and the Bronx because legitimate institutions failed to meet basic needs. Banks redlined neighborhoods, employers discriminated. Public services were underfunded or corrupt. In that context, policy bankers and their Italian overseers stepped into roles that straddled the line between predator and provider, extracting money from residents but also, at times, extending credit, funding community events, or intervening in local disputes. Coppola himself, careful to stay distant from the public face of the game, did not become a folkloric figure in the way some Harlem policy bankers did. Children did not trade stories about doing favors for Trigger Mike. They talked instead about local numbers writers or enforcers they could actually see. But the flows of money that sustained those visible figures ultimately led upward to him for a crucial span of decades, making him an unseen but constant presence in the everyday gamble of thousands of New Yorkers. When he died, the national fight against organized crime was entering a new legislative phase. Within a few years, Congress would pass the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, creating powerful tools for prosecutors to target entire criminal enterprises rather than just their foot soldiers. That statute and the investigative strategies that grew up around it would, in the 1970s and 1980s, bring down many of the structures he had once helped to build. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, his successor in the East Harlem numbers sphere, would himself be convicted under RICO in the infamous commission case of the mid-1980s, sentenced to a long federal prison term that he would not survive. By then, Michael Mike Coppola was long buried, his name remembered mainly by specialists and by an older generation of New Yorkers who could still recall the days when numbers runners were as common a sight in Harlem as mail carriers. Yet the tools used to dismantle Salerno's operation were sharpened in response to the kind of entrenched, enduring criminal enterprises that Coppola had embodied. In that sense, even in death, he cast a shadow over the evolving relationship between the American state and its underworld, an unremarkable figure to casual observers in a Florida retirement landscape, but a crucial node in the historical web that linked 3 digits on a scrap of paper to federal courtroom verdicts decades later. In the years after Michael Mike Coppola died in Florida in 1966, New York kept moving, shedding and layering identities the way it always had. The tenements of East Harlem that had framed his youth and his prime began to empty of the Italian families who had first crowded into them. Puerto Rican migrants and black Southerners, pushed north by their own histories of hardship and discrimination, filled the vacancies. The neighborhood's cadence changed, different music in the streets, different languages in the hallways, but one habit remained stubbornly familiar. People still played the numbers. Writers still knocked on apartment doors in the morning, still sat on overturned crates outside groceries, still jotted 3 digits next to small sums on folded slips of paper. Runners still hurried those slips to small offices and apartments where they were tallied against the day's take. And somewhere above those layers, in East Harlem social clubs and Bronx apartments now firmly under Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno's influence, men still calculated exposures and profits in a manner almost identical to the way Coppola's crews had done in the 1940s and 1950s. The players, for the most part, no longer spoke his name. Younger residents had grown up with Salerno as the looming Italian presence in Harlem's numbers, if they thought about such things at all. For them, Mike was more rumor than reality, a name older relatives might mention when recalling a different era, when Dutch Schultz's violence was still a recent memory, and when East Harlem was as Italian as it was anything else. Yet the structures he had helped perfect remained the invisible scaffolding, supporting the numbers racket well into the 1970s. Ironically, as law enforcement redoubled its efforts to dismantle those structures, state governments across the country began to legalize their own versions of the same activity. In 1964, New Hampshire launched the first modern state lottery. New York followed in 1967 with its own lottery, promising that proceeds would support education. Over the next 2 decades, lotteries spread to dozens of other states. Their games, daily picks, 3- and 4-digit draws, combinations of birth dates and lucky numbers, bore a striking resemblance to the neighborhood policy games that had long been illegal. For many Harlem residents who had grown up with policy, the resemblance was more than abstract. Critics within black communities pointed out that what had once been a criminal enterprise run primarily by black and Italian operators was now being openly run by the state itself. The same working-class people who had lined up to play with local writers now queued at licensed lottery outlets. The profits, instead of flowing into social clubs and quiet apartments, went into state coffers. Some former underground operators even became legal vendors, selling tickets behind counters they had once used as policy spots. Coppola did not live to see this transformation, but the line from his world to the new one was clear. The system he had exploited in Harlem and the Bronx, the steady appetite for low-stakes betting in communities starved of opportunity, had simply been adopted by governments that once condemned it. Where he and his associates had faced arrest and jail, state officials now cut ribbons on lottery offices and ran advertising campaigns urging people to play today. The moral arguments shifted from condemnation to rationalization. Illegal gambling, they said, funded crime, while legal lotteries funded schools. Meanwhile, on the other side of the legal divide, organized crime faced unprecedented pressure. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, giving prosecutors a powerful new tool to charge not just individual crimes, but the leadership of ongoing criminal enterprises. Over the next decade, investigators in New York quietly built cases using long-term surveillance, wiretaps, and flipped insiders. The numbers racket, with its daily cash movements and reliance on long-standing relationships, remained a tempting target. By the early 1980s, when federal prosecutors unsealed the indictment in what became known as the Commission case, aimed at the leadership of New York's 5 mafia families, the Genovese organization's East Harlem operations were front and center. Anthony Salerno, identified by the government as the Genovese front boss, was charged with overseeing a vast gambling empire that included numbers and sports betting. Tapes played in court captured his associates talking about policy collections, territory, and payoffs, conversations that, in content if not in accent, echoed the arrangements Coppola had made a generation earlier. Selwyn Robb, in his later History of the Mafia, and other chroniclers of organized crime have pointed out that those 1980s cases, while focused on contemporary defendants, rested on a foundation of knowledge built over decades. New York detectives who had first jotted down the name Mike Coppola in the 1930s and 1940s, state investigators who had subpoenaed him in the 1950s, and federal agents who had filed him under top hoodlum in the 1960s were all, in a sense, early contributors to the institutional memory that ultimately made the Commission case possible. Their notes and suspicions helped establish patterns. That illegal numbers gambling in Harlem and the Bronx was not a loose collection of independent hustles, but a long-term revenue stream for the Genovese family. Historians trying to reconstruct Coppola's life and role have had to work with that same patchwork of sources. There is no autobiography, no cache of personal letters. What exists are court documents, hearing transcripts, police memos, tax records, a scattering of newspaper stories, and later law enforcement summaries. From those fragments, scholars like Thomas Repetto, David Critchley, and Robb have pieced together a portrait that is at once detailed and incomplete. They can say with confidence that he was born in Calabria in 1900, that he grew up in East Harlem, that he emerged as a Prohibition-era gunman and later as a major policy boss under the Genovese family. They can document his federal tax conviction, his questioning in his wife's death, his appearances before crime commissions, his eventual relocation to Florida, and his death there in 1966. They can outline the structure of the numbers racket he helped run and note how law enforcement perceived him at various points. But when it comes to his inner life, his motivations, regrets, or justifications, they are largely in the dark. That opacity is not accidental. Secrecy was, for men in his position, both a professional necessity and a survival tactic. To leave behind a detailed written record was to risk providing prosecutors with ammunition or rivals with leverage. Even oral accounts are scarce. Unlike some mob figures who later cooperated with authorities and recounted their experiences, no such extensive testimony from Coppola exists. The only words of his that survive in the historical record are clipped courtroom exchanges and the flat denials preserved in hearing transcripts. I decline to answer on the grounds that my answer might tend to incriminate me. The result is that much of his story must be inferred from context. His early attraction to the underworld can be understood against the backdrop of East Harlem's poverty and discrimination. His move from enforcer to gambling boss fits the broader shift within organized crime from visible violence to more discreet, business-like operations. His exile to Florida aligns with known mafia practices of sidelining figures whose notoriety had become inconvenient. Yet these are patterns, not personal confessions. They place him within the currents of his time without fully revealing how he saw himself within them. The broader social meaning of his career, however, is easier to grasp. He was both a product and an agent of marginalization. As a child, he belonged to a community, Southern Italian immigrants, that was widely regarded as suspect, unassimilated, and suited mainly for manual labor. Legal opportunities were scarce. Discrimination in housing and employment was open. The underworld offered a parallel ladder, however dangerous. By the time he was middle-aged, he had climbed that ladder and was using his position to extract money from another marginalized community. Black Harlem, itself excluded from many of the same institutions that had shut out his parents' generation. That pattern of exploitation within and across oppressed groups is one of the more sobering threads in his story. Harlem's numbers game began as a largely black-run enterprise that, for all its harms, kept more of its profits within the neighborhood. When Coppola and his allies asserted control, much of that money began flowing out, to Italian social clubs, to attorneys, to quiet investments in other parts of the city. The game itself did not change in any meaningful sense for the players. They still bet the same small sums in the same hope of a windfall. What changed was where the largest share of their losses ended up. At the same time, it would be simplistic to cast him as an outsider descending on a vulnerable community purely from greed. The underworld cross-pollination between Italians and African Americans in Harlem was complex. Figures like Bumpy Johnson negotiated with Luciano's organization and later with the Genovese family to secure space and revenue for black operators. Some policy profits, even under Italian oversight, continued to support local charities, churches, or informal welfare systems. The line between predator and provider was blurred, and Coppola, operating mostly behind the scenes, was part of that ambiguity. The cultural memory of the mafia that developed in the late 20th century did not often focus on such ambiguity. Films like The Godfather and later Goodfellas presented stylized versions of Italian-American organized crime, rich with operatic family drama and cinematic violence. In those narratives, gambling sometimes appeared as a backdrop, but the painstaking, repetitive work of running a numbers empire, the counting, the record-keeping, the quiet pressure applied to keep small operators in line, rarely took center stage. Characters based loosely on more flamboyant figures drew the limelight. Men like Coppola, who had thrived on anonymity, were largely invisible. Yet for the communities that lived within the orbit of the numbers racket, men like him shaped daily reality more than any fictional don. They were the ones who decided whether a block could host a policy writer, whether a complaint about a cheating banker would be honored, whether a local operator who got too ambitious would be warned, fined, or pushed out. Their decisions affected whether money stayed on a particular street or migrated to another borough. They operated at the intersection of informal economy and quiet intimidation, making them central, if often unseen, actors in the urban history of the 20th century. In present-day Harlem and the Bronx, the specific configuration of that underworld has changed dramatically. Gentrification, shifting drug markets, new forms of digital gambling, and decades of law enforcement pressure have altered both the opportunities available to would-be racketeers and the vulnerabilities of residents. The corner policy writer with a folded pad is a rarity. In many neighborhoods, the nearest chance to pick 3 numbers legally is at a state lottery terminal inside a chain pharmacy. Its blinking screens and barcoded tickets a sanitized echo of the old system. Yet the underlying questions raised by Coppola's life remain. Why do certain communities, generation after generation, find themselves turning to informal or illegal economies to meet basic needs or fulfill basic desires? What role do organized criminal figures play when they step into roles that legitimate institutions have neglected, to provide loans, jobs, or a sense of agency, however illusory? And how should a society weigh the responsibility of individuals like Coppola against the larger structures that made their careers possible? The historical record cannot answer those questions definitively, but it does offer a lens. Through Michael Mike Coppola's trajectory, from Calabrian village to East Harlem tenement, from street enforcer to numbers baron, from New York target to Florida exile, we see not only the evolution of the American mafia, but also the enduring interplay between inequality, opportunity, and illicit enterprise. His story underscores that organized crime is never just about charismatic criminals or spectacular violence. It is about systems, habits, and everyday transactions that, taken together, shape who profits and who pays in the shadows of the official economy. In the end, the man himself recedes, as he always intended. What remains is the pattern he helped inscribe, an economy built on hope in long odds, a hierarchy rising from street corners to quiet apartments, a network that could survive the fall of any one figure so long as the conditions that fed it remained. Michael Mike Coppola spent his life navigating and exploiting that pattern. The city he moved through, and the people whose nickels and dimes sustained his rise, are still wrestling with its legacy.